let's go to a question from Jordan Dander. What's the difference between trusting in your heart, which Scripture says not to do, versus trusting in your own human faculties and intuitions for things you have strong evidence to believe are true in your heart? Is trusting in your heart more akin to trusting in your feelings, which fluctuate and change?
Well, there's a little ambiguity here for me because he may be referring to Proverbs 3, which I'll get to in a moment, where it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. That might be the reference. It might be a reference to our concern where we hear so much in our culture, follow your heart, trust in your heart, do what your heart tells you to do, and, live your truth and all of that. And that's a concern for us because in that context, we're talking about people just being slaves to their feelings in the moment instead of trusting what is good and right and true, regardless how they feel about it. So there is a concern with the cultural ethic of following your heart, okay? When it comes to Scripture, though, the Scripture doesn't say we shouldn't, well, let's go to Proverbs 3 because this is where some of the ambiguity scripturally might be coming from. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And keep in mind that the concept of heart now, biblically, Old Testament concept, is that it's the center of your being. Guard your heart, it says in Scripture. Not guard your emotions. No, there's reason that we should be careful with our emotions if we're given to following our emotions rather than following what is true. But what what the writer of Proverbs is talking about here is that our whole self should be trusting in God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. That's the center of your being. Will, intellect, emotions. And do not lean on your own understanding. That is, there's a contrast between God's way and man's way. And the writer of Proverbs is saying it's not wise to lean on our own understanding rather than on God, okay? And I say rather than on God because of what follows in the next verse. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. That would be leaning on your own understanding. Rather, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. We lean on our own understanding and we follow our heart in the sense that the modern culture says it. We are often turning towards evil, not away from evil. And the writer of Proverbs is saying here is that just trusting in human understanding, that is human assessment of things, and I don't think it's referring to using evidences and logic to come to reasonable conclusions. It has to do with a totally different value system. I say that because all through Scripture, even in Proverbs, we see an emphasis on knowledge, on observing the world, seeing how things function and work in God's world, drawing conclusions from evidences that are given us, etc. And we see this in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. So it can't be excluding that kind of thing. I think what we have here in the Proverbs passage is that we are not moving ahead as if our wisdom and our take on the reality is the only thing that matters. James has something similar in, I think, James 4 or 5, when he says, don't say, I'm going to go to this city or that city and make this money and do that. That kind of boasting is evil. Really? Boasting? Then we keep reading. Say rather, if God wills, I will do this or that. So again, there's a kind of a focus or addressing an issue where you are doing something totally on your own, based on your own thinking, wisdom, understanding as an autonomous self, without taking God into consideration. And the writer of Proverbs is saying, if you're, pardon me, if you're leaning on your own understanding, that's all you're leaning on, well, that's a bent reed. Okay, maybe it's not going to hold you. If in all your ways, by contrast, acknowledging him, then God will make your path straight. James is similar. If you're just making your plans willy-nilly here and there, hey, you don't even know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. Rather understand that God is sovereign. He can intervene in any plan that you have. Now, keep that in mind. Go ahead and make your plans. But remember, they'll only happen if God wills, that if God allows it. Okay, so I think that's the best way to understand this. Certainly in the cultural sense, we don't want to follow our feelings. We don't want to live our own truth. That's a lie. And our feelings often betray us, you know. So there's a warning there. And in Proverbs, I think we get a clear picture of exactly how, in a certain balance, we take our understanding, our perception, our reasoning, whatever, and we integrate it by leaning on God and the things that he has to say about things, and that's all part of the package.
We're supposed to be conforming our minds to who God is and his word, and that's and in that way we're supposed to learn wisdom and learn how to apply that wisdom. So all those things, as we're taking in God's wisdom, we're learning to use that in life. And so we're using our mental faculties. But I agree, Greg. I think what the Proverbs is talking about, a moral issue, not as much an intellectual issue, although of course our intellect is shaped by the state of our hearts. I thought of another verse that he might be referring to, and that's in Jeremiah 17. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So the idea is that we are bent towards believing wrong things or having a wrong, our moral compass is broken. And so we need to have that shaped by trusting in what God has told us about those things. But of course, like you said, Greg, there are all sorts of places in the Bible where we're supposed to use our intellect. I mean, even Jesus doing certain things as evidence for who he is. That's an example of saying, of asking people to evaluate what they're seeing in order to come to the conclusion that he really is the Messiah. And so there are all sorts of examples like that.